July 4, 1969, at 9:45 p.m., a family of 3 was brutally murdered in their Benicia, California home. Paul Stein, a cab driver, was shot point-blank in the head and killed at 9:45 p.m. that evening. The 25-year-old driver was ambushed in his taxi, which was parked on the corner of Cherry and Spruce Streets. The killer's motive remains unknown to this day, but their brutality is a testament to the terror they inspired. The world would come to know this killer as the Zodiac Killer. The Benicia home where the family was killed is a modest, 2-story house with a white picket fence. As the night wore on, the neighborhood became a crime scene, with police officers and forensic experts canvassing the area for clues. Bloodstains on the floor and walls marked the brutal attack, which shook the community to its core. The family's belongings were still scattered about, as if they had been interrupted in the middle of their evening routine. The killer's haste, however, belies an eerie sense of calculation. The Zodiac Killer's face remains a mystery, but we know that Paul Stein's killer was a man in his mid-20s, with a height of around 6 feet tall. The killer's hair was dark, and his build was described as slender. He was dressed in a hoodie and wore gloves, suggesting a level of premeditation that would become all too familiar in the subsequent attacks. His eyes seemed to gleam with a maniacal intensity, as if savoring the fear he inspired. His presence was so fleeting that witnesses would later describe him as a shadowy figure. Witnesses reported hearing the sound of 3 shots fired from a handgun, followed by the screeching of tires as the killer made his getaway. A neighbor claimed to have seen a man in a hooded jacket running away from the scene, but his face was obscured by the shadows. Another witness described a figure with a distinctive walk, as if he was trying to conceal his movements. The killer's escape was so smooth that it seemed as if he had planned the crime carefully in advance. As the police arrived on the scene, they began to piece together the evidence, slowly but surely revealing the shocking truth about the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer case is one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history. The central figure in this case is a man named Arthur Lee Allen. However, many investigators believe that he wasn't the actual killer, but a man named Richard Gajkowski was later suspected by another investigator, but nothing was proven. But for the purposes of this video, let's focus on Allen. Arthur Lee Allen was born in 1933 in California, and he lived a large part of his life in Vallejo, California. The majority of the investigation revolved around Allen due to his similarities to the Zodiac Killer's modus operandi. Arthur Lee Allen worked as a custodian and had a relatively ordinary life for a serial killer. He was known to be quiet and kept to himself, often avoiding eye contact. According to his acquaintances, Allen was a friendly and outgoing person who enjoyed socializing with his co-workers. However, his co-workers also reported that Allen often exhibited erratic behavior, such as becoming intensely agitated for no apparent reason. He did have a loving wife, Darlene, who stood by him throughout the investigation despite the mounting evidence pointing to Allen as the Zodiac Killer. Despite his questionable behavior, Arthur Lee Allen had a likable and relatable persona. He worked with his hands, which earned him the sympathy of his co-workers, who couldn't fathom that someone so ordinary could commit such heinous crimes. Additionally, Allen's demeanor was often described as calm and collected, which made it even more puzzling for investigators to understand how he could be responsible for the Zodiac Killer's gruesome murders. His demeanor also made it difficult for law enforcement to suspect him, as he never once exhibited any suspicious behavior. Allen's relatability made the case even more intriguing. Arthur Lee Allen had a small circle of trusted friends and acquaintances, but it was his relationship with his wife that was put to the test during the investigation. Darlene stood by her husband, even when it seemed like the entire world was turning against him. However, it's worth noting that she never openly defended him or spoke out in his favor, but her refusal to publicly denounce him was enough to raise a few eyebrows. Allen's relationship with his brother, Robert, was also scrutinized by investigators, as Robert had previously reported Arthur's erratic behavior. Despite their strained relationship, Robert was always willing to vouch for Arthur's good character. On December 20, 1968, a crisp winter evening was unfolding in Vallejo, California, a small suburban town about 30 miles north of San Francisco. The temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky was a deep shade of indigo, with a few scattered clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. It was around 5:30 p.m. when the events that would become known as the Zodiac Killer began. The streets were quiet, with only a few people out and about, going about their evening routines. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the air, a constant reminder that this was a place where crime could happen at any moment. The sequence of events leading up to the Zodiac Killer was a complex web of relationships and connections that would ultimately lead to a series of brutal murders. Michael Mageau, a 19-year-old Vallejo resident, had been dating Betty Lou Jensen, a 16-year-old high school student, but their relationship was on shaky ground. Betty's mother had forbidden her from seeing Michael, and the tension between the two was palpable. On the evening of December 20th, Michael and Betty decided to go for a drive in Michael's car, and it was on this drive that their lives, and the lives of two others, would intersect with the Zodiac Killer. The killer was waiting for them, and fate had set the stage for a deadly encounter. On that fateful night, Michael and Betty were driving down a deserted stretch of road in the area of Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when they noticed a car following them. The car, a blue sedan, pulled up behind them and a man got out, waving a gun and shouting for them to pull over. The driver, David Faraday, 17, was pulled out of the car and ordered into the trunk, where he was shot and killed. Betty was also shot and killed, while Michael managed to escape and stumble to a nearby phone booth to call for help. The killer then disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of blood and death. The most shocking single detail of the crime was the postcard sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, which read, "Dear Editor, I killed those kids last night with my 9mm. I like killing, especially children." The killer, who would come to be known as the Zodiac Killer, had sent a message to the world, and the world was left reeling in horror. The postcard was a chilling precursor to the events that would unfold in the days and weeks to come, and it would leave investigators scrambling to catch the killer before he struck again. The first person to discover what happened was Officer David Faraday, who was patrolling the area in a police car. He was alerted to the shooting by a passing motorist and arrived on the scene just as the victims were being pronounced dead. The police investigation that followed would be one of the largest and most extensive in the history of the United States, but the killer remained at large. As the police combed the area, they found a piece of a license plate that had been torn off the killer's car, but it was later revealed to be a false lead. The killer had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the faintest of clues. Comment below, what do you think really happened here? Did the police miss something, or was the killer always one step ahead? The investigation into the Zodiac Killer would span decades, with over 100 suspects identified, but the killer was never caught. Or was he? The investigation into the Zodiac Killer began on December 20, 1968, when police received a cryptic letter and a piece of the victim's clothing, a piece of a woman's breast, was mailed along with it. The note claimed responsibility for the murder of David Faraday and his girlfriend, Betty Lou Jensen, who were shot while parked in a remote area. The police were baffled by the anonymous letter and its unusual claim of being from the Zodiac Killer. They didn't know what to make of the gruesome package and its ominous message. The investigation was handed to the Vallejo Police Department. The police started interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence from the crime scene, but nothing led to any concrete breakthroughs. It wasn't until several months later, when a second letter was received, that the case gained more attention. This letter contained a cryptic message and a cipher, which the police were able to crack using a computer. This cipher provided the killer's signature symbol and the name Zodiac. The cipher became the key piece of evidence that changed everything in the case. One of the main suspects in the case was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester, who had a similar writing style to the Zodiac Killer's. He was investigated by the police and found to have a similar tattoo to the one described in one of the Zodiac Killer's letters. Another main suspect was Richard Gaikowski, a journalist who was suspected of being the Zodiac Killer due to a similar writing style and a motive. However, these leads were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. The police also investigated a few other individuals who had similar characteristics to the Zodiac Killer, but nothing seemed to stick. The case took a huge turn when the police focused on a suspect named Ross Sullivan, who claimed to be the Zodiac Killer. He provided the police with a map of where he had buried his victims, but when the police investigated this claim, they found nothing. This lead wasted months of investigation, and the police were left back to square one. The community was shocked and frightened by the Zodiac Killer's actions, and many people began to suspect their neighbors and acquaintances of being the killer. The twist or revelation nobody predicted, the one that shook the very foundations of this decades-long case, and one that still has many experts scratching their heads to this day, is that Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester, was the prime suspect identified by the Zodiac Killer Task Force back in the 1970s. The evidence against Allen was mounting, but it was never enough to convince a jury of his guilt. In fact, some of the original investigators at the time believed Allen's erratic behavior and suspicious mannerisms were indicative of a guilty conscience, but ultimately, he was never charged. Despite Allen's passing in 1992, his name remains forever linked to the Zodiac Killer mystery. Many still believe he was, in fact, the infamous killer. More detail on the twist reveals that Allen was identified as the prime suspect due to a combination of factors, including a handwriting analysis that suggested a strong similarity between Allen's writing and the Zodiac Killer's cryptic messages. Additionally, Allen's alibi for the time the first victim was murdered seemed shaky at best, leading many to speculate about his involvement. The task force even conducted a thorough search of Allen's home, where they discovered a number of disturbing items, including a fake mustache and some suspicious photographs. However, despite these findings, Allen was able to convince authorities that he was merely an enthusiastic amateur sleuth who was fascinated by the case. In the end, the lack of concrete evidence led to Allen being released and never brought to trial. The verdict or current cold case status of the Zodiac Killer case remains unchanged. Despite countless investigations, tips, and DNA evidence analysis, no official charges have been made, and the case remains one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history. The case has been reopened several times over the years, but so far, nothing has come of it. The Zodiac Killer's true identity remains a haunting mystery that may never be fully solved. As of now, the case remains a stark reminder of the darkness that lurks in human hearts. What happened to the key people after the investigation into Allen had concluded is a fascinating topic in and of itself. The original lead investigator on the case, Dave Toschi, went on to have a distinguished career in law enforcement, but the Zodiac Killer case remained an ongoing obsession for him until the end. Allen's wife, Betty, was interviewed by the media at length, but she always maintained her husband's innocence, claiming that he was simply a misunderstood man who had been unfairly targeted by the authorities. Allen's own children have spoken publicly about their father's troubled past and his possible involvement in the Zodiac Killer murders. As for the Zodiac Killer's victims, their families continue to honor their memories and seek justice to this day.